Alright guys, look, the SSPX controversy has been raging for far too long without receiving a satisfactory answer from Orthodox but traditionally minded Catholics. And the merits of the SSPX side have been greatly exaggerated by traditionalist Catholics who, amenable to some of the predilections and talking points of the SSPX, have taken a shine to them, sympathizing with their misguided cause. Unfortunately, this is an instance where, in the post-fall world, human emotions and prejudices are dominating our intellects, where passions are obscuring the truth. The SSPX are not simply good guys who've been misunderstood. They're a contumacious and rebellious bunch with a strong PR machine and a cult following on Catholic social media that's been able to paint a multitude of vices as virtues, painting rebellion as obedience to the authentic magisterium, buying themselves respect and credibility in the eyes of too many mainstream trad Catholics at the expense of fidelity to the magisterium and the unity of the church. And some even otherwise admirable men have taken to hailing them as heroes or quasi-heroes. I was fairly shocked last Easter when Taylor Marshall took back, via Twitter, all of the negative things he has ever said about the group. I've been scandalized over the course of the past year by his cozying up to them and his even pointing Catholics in their direction. And as impetus for this podcast, I was distraught recently, in the last week, a couple of days, to hear Archbishop Vigano and his recent words of praise for the SSPX. As you've likely heard, Vigano has recently said, quote, "I consider Archbishop Lefebvre an exemplary confessor of the faith, and I think that by now it's obvious that his denunciation of the council and the modernist apostasy is more relevant than ever." End quote. He goes on, "This hidden and often silent work has been carried out by the Society of St. Pius X, which deserves recognition for not having allowed the flame of tradition to be extinguished at a moment in which celebrating the ancient Mass was considered subversive and a reason for excommunication." That's a fairly strong endorsement, and it's a source of error and scandal for many. So now is the time, and this may not be popular, it may lose me supporters, yada yada, but we have a duty as soldiers of Christ to herald the truth dauntlessly, even if it's going to draw the ire of many, losing for us allies and gaining us enemies. So this might not be popular, but it is the time. It's kairos, as theologians say, for someone to step up and give a fairly robust condemnation of the SSPX and to really show their status within the church, or their lack of status within the church. So let me preface this episode with this. This issue is not, as many think it is, errantly. Whether you find the TLM of the 1962 Missal or the Mass of the Missal of Pope Paul VI, the Novus Ordo Mass, more beautiful or resplendent. It's not a TLM versus Novus Ordo issue. It simply isn't. You can appreciate the TLM without being an SSPXer or without being sympathetic to their outright rebellion against the church. So if it were simply an issue of which Mass, which form of the Mass we should say, because there's one Mass with an ordinary and extraordinary form, if that were really the issue, then many of us uncompromisingly Orthodox Catholics who are staunchly against the SSPX would indeed join their ranks. The issue is not whether you think the church was in a healthier state prior to 1962 at the start of the Second Vatican Council. That's not the issue either. The issue isn't whether you acknowledged there were some nefarious progressive clergymen who attended Vatican II and helped fashion the documents that came out of the council. There were. And that sort of skullduggery needs to be condemned. And you'll hear me and Tim, and I don't presume to speak for Tim in this episode, he has his own individual take on the SSPX. This is why this is a Dave solo show. I'm speaking for myself now and doing my own theologizing. The sole issue is whether SSPX is a schismatic group. If they are schismatic, then by endorsing them and their ideology, you're placing your own soul in danger, as co-conspirators are legally liable for the same underlying sins and crimes as the people who actually pull the trigger. Aiding and abetting a fugitive is also rightly considered a crime. It's providing material and sometimes formal support for wrongdoers. So, going back to the co-conspirator thing, if I were to conspire to, say, kill my neighbor, just making up a random example, and I was to hire a hitman or get one of my friends to go off somebody, even if they're the one who commits the crime in person, I'm liable for that crime as a co-conspirator. So it's really people who support the SSPX, their soul is on the line. But because by tying themselves to the errors and the schism of these bishops who have undertaken illicit ordination, then the SSPX is really embracing the crimes of the clergy that run their organization. So this is very, very much a priority to speak about because souls are on the line, and this is a grave sin. So let's be clear. No good can come out of schism. You hear that a lot. Well, if it weren't for the SSPX this, and if it weren't for the SSPX that. No. It's always an affront to Christ's wish for unity for his church to fall into schism. Christ is the vine and we're the branches. When we detach ourselves from him, or his church, since he says, he who rejects the apostles, the magisterium, rejects him, then all our works can amount to nothing. Even if we think we're becoming schismatics for a righteous cause, if we're defying the magisterium and the legitimate authority, then we are detaching ourselves from Christ himself. And branches will produce no fruit when they detach themselves from the vine. It will all go bad, just sooner or later. And that's why when you see schismatic groups, one of the telltale marks of schismatic groups is that they give rise to further schisms, further breakaway groups, like the Society of St. Pius V, for example. The danger of the SSPX is that they're so close to the truth on so many issues, and their reverence for the deposit of faith and their piety is undeniable and palpable. All of us Orthodox Catholics are sick of the post-conciliar nonsense, the unfaithful bishops, the clown masses, the infrequent confessions, the gay priests, the squishy sermons, the disdain for the Eucharist, the aversion to tradition hearkening back to time immemorial, the feminism that's creeping into the church. And of course, the SSPX is strongly against these things too. And this makes them an attractive nuisance to good Catholics who are discouraged with the church and maybe aren't being fed properly in the true church. So they're looking for break-off groups that share their prejudices and their predispositions and their mindset, and who agree with them on all these important liturgical and social issues. They're going to be very attracted to the SSPX. And that's problematic because the SSPX is in schism, as I'm going to prove. So we, faithful, are discouraged with the church, discouraged with the present pontificate in many regards. And take heed, clergy, you're pushing people to schismatic groups like the SSPX with your silence and your cowardice and your failure to speak out against the evils in the church and in Western society. It's pushing people away. You say you're trying to tone down the harshness of the gospel to go after the one lost sheep. But what about the 50 faithful sheep that you're leaving behind to the wolves as you go off, after the one lost sheep who in this day and age probably doesn't want you to follow after them anyway because they've made a conscious decision against the church? There's no preaching a gospel that anyone will hear. But that's neither here nor there. Let me get back to my point here. So people are discouraged. And the SSPX comes along, claiming to be the answer to the post-conciliar church. forswearing all its nonsense, all its liturgical abuses, all of its squishiness and failure to adhere to its own doctrine, failing by its own standards. And it basically says we can turn back time, pretend that Vatican II didn't happen, it need not be adhered to or accepted, that the liturgy can undergo no further development. We'll just turn back time to the 62 TLM. And that's overly simplistic. But many have been duped because it's difficult to think with the level of nuance necessary to navigate the post-conciliar waters while remaining faithful to tradition and the immutable faith. Because there is a way to root out the nonsense and the false magisterial teachings from the true ones while remaining united to Holy Mother Church. There is a way to work through all of these bad liturgical abuses and to cleanse the church of them from the inside out, not the outside in. And that's what we're called to do. There's a way to lean on the clergy to, perform Mass, to offer the Mass in the way that is actually called for by Sacrosanctum Concilium, the first document of the Second Vatican Council, and the document that reformed the liturgy in the first place. Sacrosanctum Concilium calls for Latin to be retained. It calls for Gregorian chant. It calls for organ to have pride of place. The Mass called for in Sacrosanctum Concilium is not an evil thing. What the problem is that we're not living up to the standards of liturgy that were proposed at the Second Vatican Council itself. So, it's difficult to think with this level of nuance, especially for laity that don't have a theology degree. But that's precisely what we need to do here. Note, as I just mentioned, Catholics do not need to adhere to magisterial pronouncements that unavoidably contradict past magisterial pronouncements. The thing is, none of what was taught at Vatican II contradicts the deposit of faith. It can all be reconciled, given our commitment to a hermeneutic of continuity. Nevertheless, even if Vatican II did contradict the deposit of faith, then we'd only be justified in disregarding the singular pronouncement that was errant, not the whole council, and certainly we would not be justified in disobeying the Pope to create priests and bishops the way the Sspx did. The problem is that because the Sspx is so close to truth on a whole assortment of issues, it draws many people to ruin because it's exceedingly far off from the truth on a few very important issues, like the primacy of the pontiff and the need to obey him, even when he tells you something that you disagree with, when he issues a lawful order that you disagree with. They also are very wrong about the ability to simply write off an ecumenical council of the church because it says things that you privately adjudge to be problematic. You can't do those things. And yet, those are central to the Sspx's identity. They are central to its stance and its standoff with Rome right now as we speak. So the devil is most cunning and effective when he most carefully disguises himself as an angel of light. And this is why the Sspx is so dangerous and needs to be denounced. People say, don't we have bigger fish to fry than attacking the poor old pious Sspx? The answer is actually a resounding no. The error of the Sspx is the same as the error of the modernists in the church, just on the other end of the theological spectrum. The Sspx is defiant towards the Pope and tradition in the name of upholding tradition. It's ironical. Modernists are defiant, but in an effort to destroy sacred tradition. But either way, the defiance of lawful authority remains defiance, and it's evil. One could say that a defiance that cloaks itself in obedience, however, is even more pernicious than the explicit and reckless defiance of the modernists, because it poisons the minds of people who otherwise love the truth, who are drawn to the truth, and who are seeking after the truth. unlike modernists who just keep a stranglehold on the already poisoned, warped minds of theological progressives. See, the SSPX is siphoning off people who are of goodwill generally, who love the truth, who love the beauty and richness of the church's sacred tradition. It's not just pulling people who are already far away from Holy Mother Church away, the way progressives appeal to other progressives who have a disdain for the things of tradition and the things of liturgy of old. It's not like that at all. We're pulling away people who, with just a little nudge, could successfully navigate the waters of the post-conciliar church, seeing its errors, but remaining in its bosom, remaining as faithful sons of the church. So the only issue, the singular issue, the issue upon which your opinion of the SSPX should hinge, is whether the SSPX is schismatic or whether it's in good standing in the church. If they're not in good standing, we are to dissociate from them. Indeed, it is a performed lie to take communion, the sign of unity, the sacramental and visible sign of unity in the church, with a group who is not in communion with Rome. Obviously, taking communion, we partake of the one body of Christ. And that's why it's actually a really good sign. There's an article out there talking about how the Eucharist is made of wheat. So it falls from a multitude of heads of wheat, and it is ground up and makes one host. And that's an excellent analogy for the church coming together in the Eucharistic sacrifice. All the members of the body are united in this sacramental sign as the mystical body of Christ. So let me answer the question now, and then I'm going to prove it. Yes, the SSPX are schismatic. And I'm going to show you beginning now. So a brief history. The SSPX was founded in 1970 by Marcel Lefebvre, a French archbishop, in response to the sweeping liturgical changes ushered in by Vatican II, and in response to the Council's notable tonal change for the Church. Lefebvre took issue with what he perceived as a change on the part of the Church with regard to issues like ecumenism, religious liberty, the abandonment of the TLM, and the alteration of sacramental rituals. He wanted to preserve what he called the eternal Rome, the preconciliar church, as he saw Vatican II as having introduced doctrinal errors and a lower form of liturgy. So he established, with the approval of the church, seminaries that attracted traditional young men. But in 1975, the Vatican, in its prudential judgment, withdrew its canonical recognition of the SSPX. Instead of ceasing to operate, as the early good Jesuits did when their order was temporarily disbanded in 1773 by Pope Clement XIV, Lefebvre decided to defy the Vatican and keep operating. On May 24, 1976, Pope Paul VI rebuked Archbishop Lefebvre, the first time in 200 years that a pope publicly scolded a bishop, admonishing him and his followers to change their minds about their defiant stance. Subsequently, Lefebvre announced that he was going to ordain some of his students to the priesthood at the end of June 1976. Pope Paul VI sent a special order to Lefebvre, stating he was forbidden to do so. Lefebvre ignored the Pope's command and performed the ordinations on June 29, 1976. On July 1st, 1976, the Holy See declared that, in accordance with canon law, Lefebvre was automatically suspended for 1 year from performing ordinations. Moreover, the priests he had ordained were automatically suspended from holy orders. In accordance with Canon 2331, Section 1 of the 1917 Code of Canon Law concerning obstinate disobedience to the Pope, Lefebvre was commanded to take steps to repair the scandal caused by his defiance. But in a letter July 17th to Pope Paul VI, Lefebvre remained obstinate, stating that he judged his actions as legitimate. The Pope considered this response inadequate, and on his instructions, the Congregation of Bishops on July 22nd, 1976, suspended Lefebvre for an indefinite time from all exercise of holy orders. He could not confer any sacraments save reconciliation or baptism in an emergency. This initial defiance was consummated later when Lefebvre announced that he planned on ordaining 4 bishops in defiance of the Vatican, in defiance of the Holy See. In response to this announcement, on June 9th, Pope John Paul II penned a letter in part stating, "In the letter you sent me, you appear to reject all that was agreed on in the previous conversations, since you clearly manifest your intention to provide for yourself the means to continue your work." And then he goes on, "With a paternal heart, but with all the gravity required by the present circumstances, I exhort you, Reverend Brother, not to embark on a course which, if persisted in, can only appear as a schismatic act, whose inevitable theological and canonical consequences are known to you. I earnestly invite you to return in humility to full obedience to Christ's vicar. Not only do I invite you to do so, but I ask it of you through the wounds of Christ our Redeemer, in the name of Christ, who, on the eve of his passion, prayed for his disciples that they may be one." So despite John Paul II's outreach and admonition not to go ahead with the episcopal ordinations, in 1988, as a response to the errors that had allegedly crept into the church in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, and in response to the liturgical abuses and the liturgical reform that had taken place in the wake of the Second Vatican Council, Archbishop Lefebvre and Bishop Antonio de Castro Meyer went ahead and consecrated 4 bishops, obviously without the permission of the Pope. These consecrations went down in infamy and were the impetus for all that followed basically between the SSPX and the Church. They came to be known as the Icone consecrations, a set of consecrations that took place in Switzerland on June 30th, 1988. In response to Lefebvre and his illicit ordinations to the episcopacy, John Paul II issued an excommunication for both Lefebvre and the 4 bishops that he had raised. So there was an excommunication issued, and that was the punishment for this illicit act. Ultimately, it would go on that Benedict XVI would lift the 4 bishops' excommunications as an act of mercy in 2009, but to this day, the SSPX refuses to reconcile with the Church, despite a multitude of outreaches by the Church to the SSPX. So let's analyze now whether the SSPX is in schism. First of all, what is schism, and how is it different from mere disobedience? That's obviously the question of the day, because people can disobey in the church all the time. What makes that disobedience rise to the level of schism? I think that's the dispositive question. Obviously, we have to all acknowledge that simple disobedience, even disobedience to the Supreme Pontiff, does not a schismatic act make, and nor does it make a person a schismatic. Well, St. Jerome answers this question. Quote, "Between heresy and schism, there is this difference, that heresy perverts dogma, while schism, by rebellion against the bishop, separates from the church. Nevertheless, there is no schism which does not trump up a heresy to justify its departure from the church." In other words, according to St. Jerome, schism is a rebellion against one's bishop or the pope, almost invariably motivated by doctrinal error. And the Catholic Encyclopedia also says this is schism. Schism, therefore, is usually mixed, in which case, considered from a moral standpoint, its perversity is chiefly due to the heresy which forms part of it. So, I think we're arriving at the root of it. The Canon 751 of canon law says schism is the refusal of submission to the Supreme Pontiff. And this doesn't necessarily just mean a disciplinary submission or a submission in act, but it would also imply, seemingly, a submission, the assent of faith, or giving one's assent to the magisterium of the Roman pontiff. So I think embedded in this canon is actually a two-pronged test for what is schism. And that would, of course, accord with what St. Jerome says and what Catholic Encyclopedia says, is that schism is truly an act of disobedience predicated on a doctrinal error, on a heresy, on a belief that is not reconcilable to the deposit of faith. So I think that is our working definition, and I think it's eminently justifiable. The Catechism of the Catholic Church, in section 2087, calls schism a sin against the obedience of faith, our first obligation to the Lord. So it also would seem to justify the definition that I just proffered. It's the obedience of faith. So you've got an obedience component and a faith component. And these things are the two prongs of the sin of schism, a disobedience and a lapse in faith, disobedience and heresy. And the obedience of faith, of course, is our first obligation to the Lord, as the Catechism says. So schism is a serious sin. In fact, to separate oneself from the bark of Peter is to commit spiritual suicide, because as trad Catholics know well, there is no salvation outside the Church. Now, moving along, Lefebvre has clearly broken with the Church for doctrinal reasons. He and his society are therefore in schism. He doesn't believe that the Second Vatican Council is binding on him. He's wrong. It is. In June of 1987, Lefebvre declared that Rome is in darkness, in the darkness of error, and, quote, the bishops of the whole world are following the false ideas of the Council with their ecumenism and liberalism. He concluded, quote, this is why it is likely that before I give account of my life to the good Lord, I shall have to consecrate some bishops. So here you have his faulty understanding of theology, his faulty understanding of the council, and that faulty understanding is giving rise to his disobedience, to his illicit consecration of these bishops. Therefore, I submit to you that this was an act of schism. Lefebvre wrote to the Church in 1988, again confirming his doctrinal problems with her, saying in relevant part, in his statement on cessation of negotiations, although we have never wanted to have a break in relations with Conciliar Rome, further relations could only take place in a climate of mistrust. When we think of the history of relations of Rome with the traditionalists from 1965 to this day, we are compelled to observe that there has been an unceasing and cruel persecution to force us to submit to the council. The present conciliar and modernist Rome can never tolerate the existence of a vigorous branch of the Catholic Church which condemns it by its very vitality. No doubt we shall have to wait another few years, therefore, for Rome to recover her bimillennial tradition. So clearly, Lefebvre here is saying that Rome has gone astray doctrinally, and that the SSPX has held its ground doctrinally, and therefore this matter of doctrine, this matter of belief, is giving rise to their act of disobedience and their continued staying in a state of not full communion with Rome. In Pope Benedict's 2009 letter remitting the excommunication of the SSPX bishops, he wrote, "The problems," and this is a quote, "the problems to be addressed between the Church and the SSPX are essentially doctrinal in nature and concern primarily the acceptance of the Second Vatican Council and the post-conciliar magisterium of the popes." So the problem is primarily doctrinal that is separating the SSPX from the Vatican. I think that issue, the issue of whether is a doctrinal motive for the SSPX's disobedience, is the one that is most disputed among, just rank and file churchgoers of the SSPX. They would acknowledge that the Switzerland consecrations were illicit. So they would acknowledge that that was an act of disobedience to the Pope, who told them not to do these consecrations. It was an act of disobedience to Pope John Paul II. That's almost indisputable. So the real question was whether it's a doctrinal matter at the heart of all this. And we're hearing the popes and Lefebvre himself saying, yes, our issues, what we can't reconcile, are issues of doctrine. Okay, so with regard to schism and whether the Sspx is schismatic, the fundamental question is whether one can reject the teachings of an ecumenical council and, on that basis, disobey the duly issued orders of a sitting pope, yet still remain united to the Church. It's the implications of the answer to this question that make the Sspx case so sympathetic and important for even more mainstream trad Catholics, who are often mistrustful of Vatican II, and who can blame them in the face of all the skullduggery that's taken place after the council. The answer is that, despite your desires to the contrary and your distaste for the Second Vatican Council, you aren't able to do this if you disobey a pope in a grave way over an issue of doctrine emanating from an ecumenical council. Then you've put yourself outside the Church, as we've shown above. Sometimes, before you understand how something fits into the deposit of faith, you have to take it on faith that it can be assimilated and it's not a contradiction. And I know that might sound kind of silly or even tautological to a lot of people listening, but it's not me just making that up. St. Augustine actually writes about this in the context of Scripture, saying that God gives us difficult and seemingly contradictory scriptures to draw us closer to Him in faith. He gives us perplexing things in Scripture to give us motivation to contemplate on Him throughout the day, to sanctify us and to further our understanding of the sacred mysteries. It also gives us a delight to, once we've figured out the answer to a difficult theological or scriptural or exegetical question, explain the answers to others, thereby evangelizing. There is greater delight in expounding a mystery, expounding upon a mystery that one has himself gained insight into. And now, God is not going to let the magisterium of the Church contradict the deposit of the faith in these grave matters consistently. All that said, the Sspx is in schism and should not be followed or commended by any of the faithful. Simple as. We're going to reinforce this conclusion now by recourse to the statements of the magisterium, who have the competency and the facility to make binding statements on this matter. So that said, I'm going to read what I think is the dispositive document on the standing of the Sspx in the Church right now, which was penned by John Paul II. The document is called Ecclesia Dei, and he wrote this in response to their disobedient act, the disobedient act of Lefebvre in ordaining 4 Sspx bishops against the express wishes of the Holy See. And he really unpacks the reasons for the Sspx bishops and Lefebvre's excommunication from the Church in response to the illicit ordinations. So, bear with me. It's a little long, but it needs to be heard, because this is what is going to prove from a magisterial level what the status of the Sspx is. John Paul II, quote, "With great affliction the Church has learned of the unlawful episcopal ordination conferred on June 30th last by Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre, which has frustrated all the efforts made during the previous years to ensure the full communion with the Church of the priestly fraternity of St. Pius X, founded by the same Lefebvre. These efforts, especially intense during recent months in which the Apostolic See has shown comprehension to the limits of the possible, were all to no avail. In itself," I'm skipping ahead now to section 3, "in itself, this act of Lefebvre was one of disobedience to the Roman pontiff in a very grave matter, and of supreme importance for the unity of the Church, such as is the ordination of bishops, whereby the apostolic succession is sacramentally perpetuated. Hence, such disobedience, which implies in practice the rejection of the Roman primacy, constitutes a schismatic act. In performing such an act, notwithstanding the formal canonical warning sent to them by the cardinal prefect of the Congregation for Bishops on June 17th last, Lefebvre and the priests Bernard Follet, Bernard Tissier de Melleret, Richard Williamson, and Alfonso de Galarreta have incurred the grave penalty of excommunication envisaged by ecclesiastical law. The root of this schismatic act can be discerned in an incomplete and contradictory notion of tradition. Incomplete because it does not take sufficiently into account the living character of tradition, which, as the Second Vatican Council clearly taught, comes from the apostles and progresses in the Church with the help of the Holy Spirit. There is a growth in insight into the realities and words that are being passed on. But especially contradictory is a notion of tradition which opposes the universal magisterium of the Church possessed by the Bishop of Rome and the body of bishops. So JP2 is calling out this false idea, this spurious tradition propounded by Lefebvre that says, I'm holding on to tradition by breaking with Rome. You can't do that. It's an oxymoron. So, quote, John Paul II going on, it is impossible to remain faithful to the tradition while breaking the ecclesial bond with him to whom, in the person of the Apostle Peter, Christ himself entrusted the ministry of unity in his church. Again, and appealing to this notion of St. Augustine that I just brought up, where sometimes it takes contemplation to see how certain statements of the magisterium do not contradict other statements of the magisterium, but in fact fall neatly in line and develop the prior doctrine without running afoul of it. Pope John Paul II says this, indeed, the extent and depth of the teaching of the Second Vatican Council call for a renewed commitment to deeper study in order to reveal clearly the Council's continuity with tradition, especially in points of doctrine, which, perhaps because they are new, have not yet been well understood by some sections of the Church. In other words, by studying Vatican II, we're going to see how it should be understood in a hermeneutic of continuity with prior Church teaching, and that it is not a contradiction of former doctrine, or of prior doctrine, I should say. Pope John Paul II continues, in the present circumstances, I wish especially to make an appeal both solemn and heartfelt, paternal and fraternal, to all those who, until now, have been linked in various ways to the movement of Archbishop Lefebvre, that they may fulfill the grave duty of remaining united to the Vicar of Christ in the unity of the Catholic Church, and of ceasing their support in any way for that movement. Everyone should be aware that formal adherence to the schism is a grave offense against God and carries the penalty of excommunication decreed by the Church's law. So, unpacking this a bit, John Paul II is saying that, first of all, he's explicitly calling the state of the SSPX schism. And he's saying that the laity, the parishioners who are going to these SSPX chapels and who are falling into their errant mindsets, also are going to incur upon themselves the penalty of excommunication decreed by the Church's law when if they formally fall into the errors of the SSPX. That means they're not just going to the SSPX chapels because they have a reverence for the 1962 TLM. It means they're going to the SSPX chapels because they agree with the doctrinal mistakes and errors of Lefebvre. If you are going to SSPX chapel for those reasons, then this warning of excommunication of John Paul II applies to you because you are formally, not just materially, helping them in their schism, but you are formally helping them in their schism, and you're formally adhering to their schism. He goes on, To all those Catholic faithful who feel attached to some previous liturgical and disciplinary forms of the Latin tradition, I wish to manifest my will to facilitate their ecclesial communion by means of necessary measures to guarantee respect for their rightful aspirations. So right here, you're hearing Pope John Paul II say, look, I've got you. I'm going to take care of you. I know that there is a strong contingent in the church that has a real reverence and devotion to the TLM, and we in the church are going to take care of it. He's setting this up for Ratzinger to come along and issue Summorum Pontificum, essentially re-allowing the TLM to be celebrated. He's saying that this is going to happen. So really, when Benedict XVI issues Summorum Pontificum as Pope and gives permission for the TLM to be said in the church, he's really just picking up where St. John Paul II left off. So you'll often hear SSPXers say, well, the only reason we have the Latin Mass is because of the SSPX. No. St. John Paul II, he was going to step in once he had heard from this strong contingency of people with a devotion to the Latin Mass. He was going to make concessions so they could worship in the way that was so fruitful to people for so many years since the Council of Trent. The SSPX actually jumped in and really sullied the name of the traditionalist movement. We would have the Latin Mass out of the goodwill and the good faith of John Paul II and Pope Benedict, whether or not the SSPX had fallen into schism and done this disobedient act. Even if, the argument is still stupid, because even if we wouldn't have the TLM at this point, if it weren't for the SSPX, that's consequentialism, and it has no place in Catholic moral theology. It's in the Bible. Do no evil so that good may come of it. You don't get to have a schism because you are attached to an earlier form of the liturgy. But whatever, the point is, we would have had the TLM even if it weren't for the disobedience of the SSPX, because we had a pope who truly loved the faithful and saw that there was a true hunger for the TLM, for the traditional rite on the part of the faithful, and he didn't want to leave them longing and without a place in the church. So that's actually a very reassuring thought. For our purposes here, he concludes, moreover, respect must everywhere be shown for the feelings of all those who are attached to the Latin liturgical tradition by a wide and generous application of the directives already issued some time ago by the Apostolic See for the use of the Roman Missal according to the typical edition of 1962. So he doesn't hate TLM people, he doesn't hate trads. John Paul II was taking great pains, actually, to incorporate the wishes of traditionalist Catholics into the post-conciliar church. And we were going to get Summorum Pontificum regardless of the SSPX. It was going to happen eventually anyway. There were just things that needed to be sorted out. You know, even the good guys in the church have to move slowly, meticulously. Okay, so another document that was issued calling the Sspx schismatic was one by the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legal Texts, essentially interpreting the status of the Sspx. It's a 1996 document, but I believe it was actually published or promulgated in 1998. And this is what they say, in relevant part, I'm not reading the whole document. Unfortunately, the Schismatic Act, again, calling the act schismatic, which gave rise to the motu proprio and the decree, did no more than draw to a conclusion, in particularly visible and unequivocal manner, with a most grave formal act of disobedience to the Roman pontiff, a process of distancing from hierarchical communion. As long as there are no changes which may lead to the reestablishment of this necessary communion, the whole Lefebvrean movement is to be held schismatic in view of the existence of a formal declaration by the supreme authority on this matter. And skipping ahead, as the motu proprio declares, the excommunication latae sententiae For schism regards those who adhere formally to the said schismatic movement, even if the question of the exact import of the notion of formal adherence to the schism would be a matter for the congregation of the doctrine of faith. It seems to this pontifical council that such formal adherence would have to imply two complementary elements. And this is what we were talking about earlier. Those who are in formal adherence to the schism of the SSPX, what would make them culpable also for the sin of schism? So there are two elements, and I'm going to read them. One of internal nature, consisting in a free and informed agreement with the substance of the schism. In other words, in the choice made in such a way of the followers of Lefebvre, which puts such an option above obedience to the Pope. At the root of this attitude, there will usually be positions contrary to the magisterium of the Church. And B, the other of an external character, consisting in an externalizing of this option, the most manifest sign of which will be the exclusive participation in Lefebvrean ecclesial acts, without taking part in the acts of the Catholic Church. One is dealing, however, with a sign that is not univocal, since there is the possibility that a member of the faithful may take part in the liturgical functions of the followers of Lefebvre, but without going along with their schismatic spirit. In other words, merely arriving to and going to an SSPX Mass isn't enough to say somebody is formally adhering to the schism, because again, it's unsafe to do it, and you can fall easily into the errors, but you can attend an SSPX Mass if you're solely going out of devotion for the old liturgy, and not out of agreement with any of the principles that Lefebvre has espoused and the doctrinal errors that he's espoused. But with the advent of the FSSP, which is a group that is, of course, tied to the TLM and the traditional liturgy, but who is in full communion with Rome, and of course, John Paul II is the founder of the FSSP. With the FSSP, there's absolutely no reason to go to an SSPX chapel, ever. Because everything that one would desire, if they're in good standing with the Church, in terms of liturgy, is available at FSSP Masses. So, the document goes on. In the case of the Lefebvrean deacons and priests, there seems no doubt that their ministerial activity in the ambit of this schismatic movement is more than evident sign of the fact that the two requirements mentioned above are met, and thus that there is a formal adherence. That would make Lefebvrean priests and deacons schismatics, and culpable for the punishment that comes down for schism, for the sin of schism. All the same, it will be necessary to distinguish between the moral question on the existence or not of the sin of schism and the juridical penal question on the existence of the delict of schism and its consequent sanction. So, and what this is saying is that there is a sin of schism that attaches to a private individual as soon as he commits a schismatic act. He is in schism. But there's also a juridical status of schismatic, or a juridical penalty of schism, that says the Holy See has officially pronounced that you are a schismatic, that you are in this the state of schism. And there's a difference between the two. So it's just like heresy. If I say right now that there are 4 divine persons in the Holy Trinity, and I mean it formally, like I'm intending those words and I mean my error, then I am a heretic. I am in the sin of heresy. But I am not an officially juridically defined heretic until the Holy See weighs in and pronounces me a heretic. I guess it's neither here nor there whether the SSPX have been juridically defined as schismatics, because they're in the sin of schism, and that's really what matters. They have detached themselves from the Church. Whether they've been officially declared this by the competent authorities in Rome I mean, we have a lot of magisterial documents here calling them schismatics, but whether those are juridically sufficient to make them a official schismatic, that's beyond the point. The point is they're in schism. They're in the sin of schism, whether it's been formally defined or not. Okay, so next is a letter from the Pontifical Commission, Ecclesia Dei, which was set up by John Paul II to have interaction and to try and bring the SSPX back into the bosom of the church, back into full communion with Rome. Here's a letter from Ecclesia Dei to somebody who had reached out with some questions about the status of the SSPX. So it says, "We wish to acknowledge receipt of your letter to His Eminence Cardinal Ratzinger. It has been transmitted to this Pontifical Commission as dealing with matters that come within our particular competence. With regard to the Schismatic Society of St. Pius X, again, Schismatic Society of St. Pius X, we can say the following. The priests of Society of St. Pius X are validly ordained, but suspended, that is, prohibited from exercising their priestly functions because they are not properly incarnated in a diocese or religious institute in full communion with the Holy See, and also because those ordained after the schismatic episcopal ordinations were ordained by an excommunicated bishop. They are also excommunicated if they adhere to the schism." So again, we have a competent authority in Rome saying this is schism. While up to now the Holy See has not defined what this adherence consists in, one could point to a wholesale condemnation of the Church since the Second Vatican Council and a refusal to be in communion with it. And it refers the reader to Canon 751 on the definition of schism. Further, it is likely that these priests, after 11 years in a society whose head is now an excommunicated bishop, effectively adhere to the schism. Goes on, and this is very important. The situation of the faithful attending the chapels of Society of St. Pius X is more complicated. They may attend Mass there primarily because of an attraction to the earlier form of the Roman Rite, in which case they incur no penalty. The difficulty is that the longer they frequent these chapels, the more likely it is that they will slowly imbibe the schismatic mentality which stands in judgment of the Church and refuses submission to the Roman Pontiff and communion with the members of the Church subject to him. If that becomes the case, then it would seem that they adhere to the schism and are consequently excommunicated. Again, they are co-conspirators, as I had mentioned earlier, if they're attending SSPX Chapel because they think the Second Vatican Council wasn't valid. If they think that what Lefebvre did in ordaining his bishops illicitly was a justified act. If they think that Lefebvre is justified in continuing to thumb his nose at the Vatican. Obviously, he's dead now, but that would place the actual people going, the laity going to the SSPX chapels in the state of schism and in excommunication latae sententiae, which is like an automatically given excommunication. So this is serious stuff. This is very, very serious. Okay, so continuing on with Ecclesia Dei's letter, quote, "For these reasons, this Pontifical Commission cannot encourage you to frequent the chapel of the Society of St. Pius X. On the other hand, it would seem that you are among those who attend Mass in chapels of the Society of St. Pius X because of the reverence and devotion which they find there, because of their attraction to the traditional Latin Mass, and not because they refuse submission to the Roman Pontiff or reject communion with the members of the Church subject to him. At the same time, it must be admitted that this is an irregular situation, even if the circumstances which have caused it have come about through no fault of your own, and it should be remedied as soon as circumstances permit." So now I'm going to briefly pivot and just look at what some of the higher-ups in the church, some of the high-ranking prelates, have said about the status of the SSPX when they're kind of speaking off the cuff. Cardinal Raymond Burke, who is the former head of the Apostolic Signatura, the Vatican's highest court, made remarks at a sacred liturgy conference in Medford, Oregon. In answer to a question about attending liturgies offered by the Sspx, Burke said, "The fact of the matter is that the priestly society of St. Pius X is in schism, since the late Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre ordained 4 bishops without the mandate of the Roman pontiff, and so it is not legitimate to attend Mass or to receive the sacraments in a church that's under the direction of the priestly society of St. Pius X. Now, obviously, Ecclesia Dei would say that if you're just going out of reverence for the old Mass, for the old liturgy, then you can go as long as you don't fall into any of the doctrinal beliefs that led for the Sspx to break away in the first place. So I guess I would fall more on the Ecclesia Dei interpretation, but here we have Cardinal Burke, who's very well respected in conservative quarters of the church, just calling them schismatic, calling the Sspx in schism without hesitation and explicitly. Now, Cardinal Gerhard Mueller, who, as we all know, is the former prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, has also said the Sspx is in schism in comments he made in 2013 to the Italian press. He said, quote, "The canonical excommunication of the bishops for their illegal ordinations was revoked, but a de facto sacramental excommunication remains for their schism. They put themselves out of communion with the Church. After that, we are not closing the door and never will, but we are inviting them to be reconciled. But they too must change their attitude, accept the conditions of the Catholic Church and the Supreme Pontiff as the definitive criterion for membership." And again, Mueller is in many ways a conservative hero. He's the CDF head under Pope Benedict, and he hewed very closely to Catholic tradition and doctrine, of course. He was a faithful steward. So he is on the record saying they're in schism, and this is a heavy hitter. This isn't just some low-ranking bishop or something to that effect. This is the former prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of Faith. So I don't see what all of the fuss is about, honestly. It seems like lately the Sspx has really been winning the conversation about their status. They don't want to be called schismatic. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say we can defy the Roman pontiff and we can not accept the mandates of the Second Vatican Council and the doctrines promulgated by the Second Vatican Council. And yet at the same time, we're not going to be tarnished with the label schismatic. You don't get to have your cake and eat it too. So I don't know why so many people can possibly buy into this. The evidence in favor of the Sspx being a schismatic group is strong and irrefutable in my mind. As we've seen, they definitely are a group that has defied the Pope on a doctrinal basis, which is the definition of schism. Those are the conditions for schism. That's the definition of the schismatic. They've certainly done that. And we've had several popes and folks under the popes working in coordination with the popes to try and bring the Sspx back into the church, explicitly label them as a group in schism, as a schismatic group. So it doesn't seem like there should be this much difficulty in accepting their status. But within traditional Catholicism, because they are a sympathetic cause, because they hew closely to tradition. They like the TLM. We all like the TLM. It's a beautiful thing. They like to hear confessions. They like to do the old form of things and value apostolic paradosis, that handing on of the deposit of faith by the apostles. And they do adhere closely to doctrines that we don't hear spoken of very much in the church. Things like there's no salvation outside of the church, or say the social kingship of Christ. Even the real presence in the Eucharist. These things you're going to find propounded strongly by the Sspx, so that makes them attractive. And because there's that attraction to this group that is uncompromisingly traditional, then people are starting to allow their will to shape their mind as opposed to letting their mind shape their will. A lot of people are very sympathetic to the SSPX, especially after the shutdown of the church with coronavirus going on. A lot of the only places that one could receive the sacraments for so long was at the SSPX chapels, who stayed open to the faithful. And like I said, if you're going to the chapel just to get the Eucharist during a church shutdown, then there's no sin in that. The sin would be if you go to an SSPX chapel because you believe what they believe, where they err. If you go when you endorse their disobedience to the Pope. Those are the things that would make you be in danger of sin or in sin. But a lot of people were very relieved that they were able to get confession in the Eucharist during coronavirus, and that's drawn some people to them. And yeah, the church is opening back up now. There shouldn't have been this long of a shutdown. There shouldn't have been a shutdown at all, really. It's inexcusable how the church has handled itself under this, what appears to be a completely trumped up virus and a politicized virus. The church did not handle it well, and that's pushed people out the door to the SSPX. But nevertheless, despite your sympathies for their reverence for the Mass, despite your sympathy for their devotion to the Holy Eucharist and to the beauty of the Tridentine liturgy, you may not start to soften your stance on the SSPX, because that's leading people. When stances are softened on things, it leads people astray. When the government starts to say, maybe marijuana is not so bad and it's not really that much of a drug after all, people start to smoke. When the government says, abortion, it might not really be killing a baby, it might just be an issue of women's choice and it's a clump of cells, people go get abortions. When you say, maybe the SSPX aren't really schismatic and they've got some valid points, people are going to wind up at SSPX chapels, and their souls are at danger because they are slowly going to imbibe the toxins that the SSPX is preaching. And these toxins are especially dangerous because they're mixed in with 99% of a chalice of delicious wine. So that's why it's so dangerous. The toxins are imperceptible to all but the most refined palates because they are diluted so well in a finely aged wine. So we can't soften our tone on the SSPX just because, our disordered wills are saying, well, they kind of agree with me mostly, so therefore I can kind of condone what they're doing a little bit. You can't be like this. The Reagan rule does not apply to the SSPX. It's not somebody who agrees with me on 80% of the issues is my friend, not my enemy. No, when it comes to the church, you're either all in or all out. There is no salvation outside the bark of Peter. So you have to be in the church all the way, and if you're not, if you break with Rome, if you start saying certain ecumenical councils are wrong, if you start saying I don't have to adhere to what an ecumenical council is promulgating, then you are outside the church, and no one can be condoned for going over to your side. No one can be lauded for taking your part. We have to withdraw from you, and we have to condemn you. Okay, so pivoting, and this is the final part of the show. There are numerous SSPX objections that I hear bandied about that I want to handle one by one because they're not meritorious. SSPX tend to be a little bit like Protestants in that they are well schooled on certain talking points that can make it sound to an uneducated audience like they really know what they're talking about, like they're really intelligent and they have the better side of these arguments, but they don't. Whenever you stray from Rome, you're never going to have the better side of the arguments. That's a rule, and it's a hard and fast one. So their arguments can be defeated and these objections can be put down, and I want to do so now to show people that they're kind of all bark and no bite. So one of the objections you hear a lot is that the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei elsewhere states that the SSPX isn't in formal schism, and they point to this as a proof text to say, look, well, obviously we're not in schism. Well, obviously this doesn't pass the smell test, because we just quoted, 5 official church documents or so saying that they are in schism. So what does that mean? How can this be? Are they proof texting us? Is this dispositive? Are they right about this? No, because you have to look at the way Ecclesia Dei is using the term formal schism. The way Ecclesia Dei was using the term formal schism when it spoke of this was that formal schism means that a party has been adjudicated officially as schismatic. So one is a schismatic the moment they commit the sin of schism. But you are not a formal schismatic until it has been magisterially, formally stated that you are a schismatic. Just like how I explained with heresy. I can say a heresy right now and I become a heretic the minute I say it. But I'm not a formal heretic in this equivocal sense, in this other meaning of the word, until I have been adjudicated as a heretic by the church. So they're using a bit of wordplay here to try and throw people off. Yes, you are a schismatic the moment you break with Rome over a doctrinal reason. You disobey the pontiff and break communion with the supreme pontiff for a doctrinal reason. You are right then a schismatic. You are in schism. But until the Vatican, the Holy See, officially labels you a schismatic, then by this definition you are not a formal schismatic. But the sin of schism is still a grave sin. And an analogy is the crime of murder. I am a murderer the moment I kill an innocent person. I have become morally and ontologically a murderer. And yet, I am not an adjudicated murderer legally, because innocent till proven guilty. I'm not adjudicated a murderer until a court of competent jurisdiction hands down a finding that I am a murderer, a verdict that I have committed the crime of murder, and then sentences me as a murderer. So until I am adjudicated as a murderer by a court who issues a formal verdict, then I am not a legal murderer. But I am a murderer the moment I kill somebody. That's the analogy. So I hope everybody understands now. So other objections. A lot of times you're going to hear that Vatican II was only a pastoral council and not a doctrinal one. So hence one does not need to give assent to the teachings of Vatican II. Well, that's erroneous. That's a misunderstanding of what we mean when we say that Vatican II was primarily a pastoral council as opposed to a doctrinal council. It's a pastoral council in the sense that it was mainly concerned with acting as a hedge, as warding off the dangers of modernism by promoting ways to evangelize the faithful in 20th and 21st century world. But nevertheless, it certainly develops doctrine in many ways. It certainly explains doctrine and deepens our understanding of doctrine. However, it didn't attach any anathemas to its doctrinal teachings. In other words, it wasn't infallibly teaching any new doctrines. So that's what we mean when we say it wasn't a doctrinal council. It doesn't mean that it didn't have anything to say that furthered our understanding of the church's doctrines. It did. It was certainly magisterial in that respect, and it certainly developed the church's doctrine. It just didn't do so infallibly, like many other councils where you're going to hear anathemas attached to this extraordinary act of the magisterium. But definitely, Dei Verbum advanced the church's teaching of divine revelation and how scripture, tradition, and magisterium work together. Gaudium et Spes ushered in a new era of understanding of the laity's role in the church and salvation history. So, it's not a well-formulated objection, but nevertheless, Code of Canon Law, Canon 752, addresses the mentality underlying this objection, saying, although not an assent of faith, a religious submission of the intellect and will must be given to a doctrine which the Supreme Pontiff or the College of Bishops declares concerning faith or morals when they exercise the authentic magisterium, even if they do not intend to proclaim it by definitive act. Therefore, the Christian faithful are to take care to avoid those things which do not agree with it. So, here you have the Code of Canon Law, which is of course predicated on doctrine, saying that even though a pope or a council isn't saying something definitively, meaning infallibly, and something that must bind you with an assent of faith, you still have to submit to it. You don't get to say, well, it wasn't a doctrinal council, they didn't attach any anathemas, so I'm free to disagree. No, that's what the left did in the wake of Humanae Vitae. They said, oh, look, this isn't, an anathema attached to the Pope saying you can't have recourse to contraception. There's no infallible teaching that you can't have recourse to contraception. Therefore, I can dissent. No, that's not right. That kind of logic must be forsworn by the faithful in the church, and it's actually against canon law and the teaching of the magisterium. So that objection doesn't hold. The SSPX are not free to reject the Second Vatican Council just because it was mainly pastoral and not doctrinal in the sense that it had definitively binding teachings. Another objection is that the excommunication of the SSPX bishops was lifted, and therefore the SSPX is no longer in schism. I've never understood this because it so obviously is not a good objection. It's so obviously erroneous. It conflates the crime with the punishment. Just because a court commutes someone's sentence in an act of mercy or clemency doesn't mean that the person isn't guilty of the original crime. One is still a murderer, even if he's not even convicted of murder in the first place, assuming that he's unjustly killed somebody. Even if I were to get a pardon from my governor or from the president for the crime of murder, depending if it was state or federal, then I would still be a murderer if I had committed the crime of murder. Just because I get a pardon for something in an act of clemency doesn't mean I'm not guilty of the original act, or that I'm not ontologically in a certain state. The dagger in the heart of this theory is that the Church under Pope Paul VI lifted the excommunication of the Orthodox in 1965. And I'm pretty sure we all agree that the Orthodox are still in schism. Just because you lift the punishment doesn't mean that the crime didn't take place, and doesn't mean that the crime is still not taking place. It's, and that's why it's troublesome when I don't think it's well advised to be lifting the punishment for a crime that's still taking place. But Pope Benedict explained why he did it, and he explains that he was really trying to create more fruitful dialogue and a spirit of trust and fraternity by, as a gesture of goodwill, lifting this punishment, and that he hoped that it would draw the SSPX back into the bosom of the Church. He actually wrote in Ecclesiae Unitatem, section 4, why he lifted the excommunication. He says, quote, in the same spirit and with the same commitment to encouraging the resolution of all fractures and divisions in the Church, and to healing a wound in the ecclesial fabric that was more and more painfully felt, I wished to remit the excommunication of the 4 bishops illicitly ordained by Archbishop Lefebvre. With this decision, I intended to remove an impediment that might have jeopardized the opening of a door to dialogue, and thereby invite the bishops and the Society of St. Pius X to rediscover the path to full communion with the Church. As I explained in my letter to the Catholic bishops of last March 10th, the remission of the excommunication was a measure taken in the context of ecclesiastical discipline to free the individuals from the burden of conscience constituted by the most serious of ecclesiastical penalties. However, the doctrinal questions obviously remain, And until they are clarified, the society has no canonical status in the church, and its ministers cannot legitimately exercise any ministry. He also wrote in a letter to the world's bishops explaining his lifting of the excommunication of the Sspx a little bit more about it. He called it a discreet gesture of mercy towards 4 bishops ordained validly but not legitimately. It's a gesture of mercy. It's not because he's recognizing that the church was wrong or that the Sspx position is meritorious. Far from it. He goes on, the remission of the excommunication has the same aim as that of the punishment, namely to invite the 4 bishops once more to return. This gesture was possible once the interested parties had expressed their recognition in principle of the Pope and his authority as pastor, albeit with some reservations in the area of obedience to his doctrinal authority and to the authority of the Church. Here I return to the distinction between individuals and institutions. The remission of the excommunication was a measure taken in the field of ecclesiastical discipline. The individuals were freed from the burden of conscience constituted by the most serious of ecclesiastical penalties. This disciplinary level needs to be distinguished from the doctrinal level. They're still in doctrinal error, in other words. He goes on, the fact that the Society of St. Pius X does not possess a canonical status in the Church is not in the end based on disciplinary but on doctrinal reasons. As long as the Society does not have a canonical status in the Church, its ministers do not exercise legitimate ministries in the Church. There needs to be a distinction then between the disciplinary level, which deals with individuals as such, and the doctrinal level, at which a ministry and institution are involved. In order to make this clear once again, until the doctrinal questions are clarified, the society has no canonical standing in the Church. So Benedict XVI is answering this objection himself. They're still schismatic. They're still not in the Church. Yeah, so the objection that because the Vatican lifted the excommunication of the Sspx, they somehow reconciled with the Sspx, doesn't hold any water. There is a distinction between schism and the state of being excommunicated. People must think that they're synonyms or something. They're not. They mean different things. Schism is the crime, excommunication is the punishment. And just because you lift somebody's punishment or commute their sentence does not mean that they have not committed a crime. It doesn't even mean they're still not committing a crime. It just means that you're giving them an act of mercy. So the fact that the Sspx excommunication has been lifted is immaterial to their status as schismatics. It should not be used anymore as evidence of their non-schismatic state. We also hear now that the Church allows the Sspx to hear confessions and to witness marriages of the faithful. And people take that and they're like, well, the Church is letting them exercise this ministry, so therefore the Sspx must not be schismatic. Wrong. You're presuming that the Church did this as a concession to the Sspx, as some way of saying, oh, Sspx, we like you more now. Come back into the bosom of the Church. We want you, we recognize the laicity of your position, and therefore we're going to be more open to you. That's not what the Church was saying. Allowing Sspx to validly confect some of the sacraments, to hear confession, to witness marriages, was an act of mercy that was really done by Pope Francis in the year of mercy and thereafter. So for the good of the faithful, not for the good of the Sspx. It was for the good of the faithful who might have been in ignorance attending Sspx functions, receiving sacraments that were not valid from the Sspx. Because although certain Sspx sacraments were valid, baptism, the Holy Communion, you have to have jurisdiction for some sacraments. For confession, you need jurisdiction granted to you by a bishop, by a validly ordained bishop, and by a bishop that has, canonical standing in the Church. The Sspx did not have that. So their confessions for a long period of time were not valid until Pope Francis gave them the jurisdiction to hear confessions and absolve sins. That was something done in accord with the year of mercy, so that people would actually be having their sins forgiven efficaciously by the priest, as opposed to being bogged down in mortal sin and ignorance. If you think that was for the SSPX, you've got another think coming. And it's the same with marriages. Pope Francis, as an extension of his year of mercy, really wanted people to be in validly consummated marriages, to be in true marriages. And again, for the baptized, for those baptized in the church, you need to be married in the church. And if you don't get married in the church, then your marriage is invalid. It's not just an illicit marriage, it's actually an invalid marriage. If you were born as a Catholic and then you go and you stop practicing your faith and you get married on the beach somewhere, your marriage isn't valid. So Pope Francis didn't want this happening for the faithful. So again, he extended, because so many faithful are ignorant as to the schismatic status of the SSPX, he extended this as a mercy. He extended these faculties to the SSPX as a mercy. And even with marriage, he made it contingent upon the permission of the local Catholic ordinary, and in conversation with parish priests as to whether the SSPX marriages could take place. So here's what Pope Francis actually said about his reason for doing this. A final consideration concerns those faithful who, for various reasons, choose to attend churches officiated by priests of the Fraternity of St. Pius X. This Jubilee Year of Mercy excludes no one. From various quarters, several brother bishops have told me of their good faith and sacramental practice, combined, however, with an uneasy situation from the pastoral standpoint. I trust that in the near future, solutions may be found to recover full communion with the priests and superiors of the fraternity. So again, they're not in full communion. And Pope Francis explains, in the meantime, motivated by the need to respond to the good of these faithful, not the SSPX, these faithful, through my own disposition, I established that those who during the Holy Year of Mercy approach SSPX priests to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation shall validly and licitly receive the absolution of their sins. So he did this for the faithful in the Year of Mercy, so that God's grace and mercy could reach everybody, even those attending the schismatic SSPX chapels. With regard to marriage, it's the exact same. Pope Francis, through the CDF, allowed for the SSPX to witness validly the marriages of the faithful. So this one document from Mueller actually says, as you are aware, for some time various meetings and other initiatives have been ongoing in order to bring the Society of St. Pius X into full communion. Recently, the Holy Father decided, for example, to grant all priests of said society the faculty to validly administer the sacrament of penance to the faithful, such as to ensure the validity and licity of the sacrament and allay any concerns on the part of the faithful. Following the same pastoral outlook which seeks to reassure the conscience of the faithful, despite the objective persistence of the canonical irregularity in which for the time being the Society of St. Pius X finds itself, the Holy Father, following a proposal by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith and the Pontifical Commission Ecclesia Dei, has decided to authorize local ordinaries the possibility to grant faculties for the celebration of marriages of faithful who follow the pastoral activity of the SSPX, according to the following provisions. And we don't need to go into all that. But so it was on account of the faithful. Again, it has nothing to do with doctrine, the doctrinal stances of the SSPX. It has nothing to do with them coming further into the bosom of Holy Mother Church. It doesn't. They're irregular. They find themselves outside the church. They're not in full communion. That much is clear. So these are not good arguments. You also hear the SSPX is not schismatic. It's just in, quote, irregular canonical status. You guys, you have to understand that's a euphemism being used by the Vatican to be diplomatic about saying you're schismatic. It's like saying I'm not divorced and remarried, I'm in irregular marital status. I'm sorry, that would be a euphemism for adultery, for an adulterous second union, right? It's a euphemism used by the diplomats in the church so as to not drive the schismatic SSPX away farther. Just like the church is loath to call adulterous unions adulterous, and rather prefers to call them irregular. It's just being nice at the expense of truth. This is why you also shouldn't use euphemisms, because it gives rise to false ideas. It's better to just say things bluntly and straightforwardly and correctly and with precision. So, irregular status, i.e. being a schismatic. Another objection that you run into frequently is that, SSPXers say that Novus Ordo is invalid because the TLM can ostensibly never be changed because the bull quo primum of Pius V that promulgated the TLM states that the TLM must be used now and forever throughout all the provinces of the Christian land and, quote, into perpetuity, and therefore that changes to it, it is suggested by the SSPXers, are a violation of doctrine. This is horse feathers, and the people at the top, even of the SSPX, know it. It's like Protestants quoting Romans at Catholics to justify their belief in salvation by faith alone. Just a little bit of study fully rebuts the asinine claim. The Pope can only bind the Church at the papal level of authority, unless he's speaking infallibly, ex cathedra, and invoking the extraordinary magisterium to say that something is actually part and parcel of the deposit of faith, and therefore it can never change. Clearly, Pius V was not doing this when he promulgated quo primum. He was not saying that the TLM is a matter of doctrine that's tied to the deposit of the faith. He couldn't say that. For most aspects of the liturgy, aside from the essentials, the liturgy of the Word and the liturgy of the Eucharist, and really the form of the sacrament, the words of consecration, and some other things that are set up at the altar, most of it is actually disciplinary in nature and non-doctrinal. The missal used by the SSPX, the missal of John the 23rd, is actually full of revisions to the missal of Pius V. So it differs from earlier editions of the Missal of Pius V in many ways. It incorporated the change made by John the 23rd in 1962 when he inserted into the canon of the Mass the name of Saint Joseph, which was one of the first changes in centuries for the canon of the Mass. It also incorporated changes that Pope Pius XII made in 1955 in the Liturgy of Palm Sunday and the Easter Triduum. So while Pius V decreed, quote, "We order and enjoin that nothing must be added to our recently published missal, nothing omitted from it, nor anything whatsoever be changed within it," this is certainly not preventing changes by a future pope. Pope Pius V himself later added to the missal the Feast of Our Lady of Victory, celebrating the victory of Lepanto. And this is all, I'm just reading off of Wikipedia right now. It's a legal maxim that what is bound at one level of authority can be unbound by the next person who sits at that same level of authority. A president's executive order can be unmade by the next sitting president. For proof of this, we just point to Clement VIII. Clement VIII, just a few short years after the reign of Pius V, edited and revised Pope Pius V's missal, making alterations in scriptural texts and in other matters. He abolished some prayers that the 1570 missal obliged the priest to say on entering the church. He shortened 2 prayers to be said after the Confiteor. He directed that the words, "Do this in memory of me," should not be said while displaying the chalice to the people after consecration, but before doing so. He inserted directions at several points of the canon that the priest was to pronounce words inaudibly. He suppressed the rule that at High Mass, the priest, even if not a bishop, was to give the final blessing with 3 signs of the cross, and rewrote the rubrics, including, for instance, the ringing of a small bell. So, liturgy has changed. It always has changed. The earliest liturgies were Greek. Until the 3rd century, liturgy, even that of Rome, was in Greek. Hence why we have the Kyrie eleison. It was a Greek prayer that was widely used and therefore was retained even in the Latin liturgy. Most components of liturgy are not strictly doctrinal, as we've already said. That they don't have to be adhered to verbatim for the most part in order to be valid and efficacious. While there are some things like the words of absolution and confession and the words of consecration of the Eucharist that must be said, i.e. the form of the sacraments, many parts of the liturgy are disciplinary and the Church has the power to change them with the keys to the kingdom. The many parts and doxologies of the liturgy are disciplinary and not doctrinal is evidenced by the sheer number of rites that are recognized by the Catholic Church. And even the bull of Pius V, Quo Primum, that allowed for previous liturgies to be used as long as those liturgies were over 200 years old, because obviously he was writing around the time of the Protestant Reformation, and he wanted to make sure that no Protestant mischief and heresy and error made its way in to the Catholic Mass. So he allowed for other rites to be preserved, other liturgies to be preserved, granted that they were over 200 years old. So no, Quo Primum does not dogmatically define that the TLM is the only Mass that can ever be used. And even if the Pope tried to do that, the next sitting Pope on the same level of authority could just override it, because he becomes the steward of Christ's kingdom here on earth, the Church. And this should bother everybody, but the SSPX claimed that the Novus Ordo Mass is evil, and it's better to not attend church at all than to go to a Novus Ordo Mass. I think that's proof positive of a schism, saying that the ordinary form of the Mass is evil. They talk about how failure to rise to the level of the greatest good makes something evil. So this is the wordplay that's going on right now. They define the TLM as the greatest good in liturgy, and therefore claim that the Novus Ordo, since it's ostensibly allowing for fewer graces, they claim that it's evil because it doesn't rise to that pinnacle, that high point of grace that is supposedly found in the TLM. So this, again, guerrilla logic. Even accepting their premise arguendo, that the new Mass is inferior to the old one in terms of graces delivered, the new Mass still gives us the Holy Eucharist, something of infinite value, which makes us into living tabernacles of Christ. This is an indisputable net positive. Even if the new Mass, the Novus Ordo, somehow actually did yield fewer accidental graces than the TLM, despite the fact that we're in the presence of the infinite font of all graces, Christ himself, who is truly present in the Eucharist, in the Novus Ordo. But even if the Novus Ordo yielded fewer accidental graces than the TLM, it remains a net plus to receive the sacraments there, to hear the Word of God preached there, to take part in the prayers that the priest is offering up to the Father, to offer up the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ along with the priest in our role as the laity, which is, of course, a different type of sacrificial offering, but nevertheless offering up the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ to God the Father. That is not an evil thing. That is not a worthless thing. That is not a net negative when it comes to graces, to say the least. But by the logic of the SSPX, anything that's not perfectly efficacious in terms of yielding graces is evil. By this logic, saying a quick prayer is an evil, since a person could have said the divine office instead. It makes no sense. They're just using wordplay to fool the gullible, the people that have little education in the theological sciences, by couching their diction in this highfalutin Thomistic lexicon. They're essentially pulling the wool over your eyes. You guys are being hoodwinked. You're telling me that being in the presence of the living God of the universe in our tabernacles, even in the Novus Ordo, even if there's skullduggery and progressive mischief going on with, some of the liturgical abuses, you're telling me that's a net negative to receive the most blessed sacrament? To be there hearing the undefiled gospel? To be hearing these ancient prayers of the church? You get out of here. That's wrong and it's silly, and I hope no one is taken by this. Not anymore. You also hear it said that it's Lefebvre who's undertaken the illicit episcopal consecration and therefore performed a schismatic act, if the act is schismatic at all, which I think we've proved that it is. But it's for this reason that bishops consecrated by him have been suspended and excommunicated, and they're maybe in schism, so the logic would go. The priests and the faithful of the society have not been excommunicated, and they are not heretics. You'll hear that said. But we've already seen in Ecclesia Dei and the Pontifical Council for the Interpretation of Legislative Texts talking about it earlier. The priests who have been in this society for this long have certainly imbibed enough of the toxic heresy and schism that they are formal adherents of the heresy and schism, and therefore that they would be deserving of this excommunication latae sententiae that goes along with the crime of schism. And that the same thing goes for the laity, who exclusively are attending SSPX chapels because they have a disdain for the Second Vatican Council, or they think that the Novus Ordo is not a valid form of the Mass. They too, it appears, have formally fallen into the schism. So this logic is also bad. The Scripture talks about how in the end days even the elect are going to be deceived. And this verse always bothered me, it always vexed me, as it doesn't seem like the faithful of Christ would ever really leave the church or apostate themselves. It seems like a hard thing to do. No one's ever going to be able to convince me that Christ isn't our Lord, and no one is going to ever be able to draw me away from him. I will remain a faithful son of the church and a faithful servant of Christ till my dying breath. But I feel like this could be directed at those who are being siphoned away from the church in the name of the church itself. They're being robbed of tradition in the name of tradition itself. There's a certain trickery that's very sneaky and very subtle in actually pulling people away from Christ under the disguise of leading them closer to Christ. And it's just something to contemplate on. Perhaps this is what the Bible could be referring to. That in the end days, people are going to be so fed up and discouraged with the abuses in the institutional church, in the sacramental church, that they're going to be looking for these alternatives, and they're going to put themselves in schism by going off and wandering astray to these alternative quasi-churches, or what have you. It's just something I was thinking about recently, but I don't know. I just wanted to throw it out there. So it's folly to go astray with the SSPX. They are a schismatic group. If you are with them and you're imbibing some of their bad ideas, some of their schismatic ideas, their rejection of the Second Vatican Council, and their refusal to submit to the Roman Pontiff, you are in serious error and you need to repent of that. It's something you need to go to confession for and confess possibly the sin of formal schism. Now, obviously, like we've said before, I don't want anybody getting scrupulous about this. If you don't buy into the errant theology of the SSPX, but instead you're attending their chapel solely out of a devotion to the TLM, to the old liturgy, then you probably are in good standing with the church. You just want to make sure by continuing to go that you are not going to fall into their errors. So you need to guard your soul closely. I would also say that there's no reason to go to an SSPX chapel as a member of the faithful, especially with the advent of the FSSP, who are in good standing in the church and do celebrate the TLM and have a special devotion to the Tridentine Rite. So that being the case, it's almost indefensible, even on a practical level, for anyone to be going to an SSPX chapel. That said, truth dies in secrecy and lies flourish in subtlety. We need public debate on this matter, and I would welcome debate on someone's platform on the topic of the SSPX. It's a topic that's salient to the very viability of the traditionalist movement in the church, because united we stand and divided we fall. And if there are some traditionalists that are falling into this bear trap of the SSPX, they need to be disabused of that, or they're going to start leading the entire traditionalist movement astray, and we can't have that. One of the main components of traditionalism always must be unwavering orthodoxy and unwavering fidelity to the magisterium. And that fidelity to the magisterium, even in cases when they err, has to come inside the church, not outside the church. We have to correct our bishops when they err from inside the church, not from outside it. But that's all I have for tonight, guys. God bless you all. Please hit us up in the comments. Keep supporting us, please, on Patreon. And also, my wife Rebecca and I are going to be doing, as we've announced previously, a Catholic home economics and homeschooling course. It's going to be a course devoted to teaching the lost art of running a traditional Catholic household in a 21st century world that's gone astray. It's going to be dedicated to teaching those skills to women that they're going to need to bring up the children in a classical Catholic way, to teaching husbands what their duty is, to giving a theology of the family, to talking about how to formulate your homeschool lessons, talking about how to build a lesson plan and a curriculum in homeschool, and what you need to teach your kids so that they can grow in knowledge of the truth, goodness, and beauty of the Lord. So I'm going to run a commercial for that right after this, so you can take a look at what we're planning to offer. Please do support us with that too. We hope to have a really big, lively class. We've got quite a few so far, but there's still slots open for the class, so please do enroll. And check out my new website, drgcatholic.com. It's drgcatholic.com. All right, guys, signing off. Hi, we're Dave and Rebecca Gordon, and we've begun a class dedicated to taking back the culture in the 21st century.
Join us in our Catholic Home Economics course starting October 3rd to learn what it takes to bring up your families in Christ in this broken world.
We'll be addressing the fundamentals of Christian homemaking, how to live out your Christian vocation in marriage, how to raise, discipline, and educate your kids in the fear of the Lord, how to successfully homeschool your kids, how to manage household time and finances, and what a Christian household looks like in practice. While the class is primarily going to be practical, we're also going to be taking a look at the theology of the family.
Please join us in our interactive course so that together we can follow Christ's calling in our vocation of marriage and family.
Classes are going to start in October and run to January. They're once-a-week classes for an hour-and-a-half sessions, and they're going to be interactive. Please look in the show notes for the link to our Teachable Academy.
We look forward to seeing you there.